Related research. Although Maslow's theory of self-actualization has been very important theoretically, until recently it has not stimulated much direct empirical testing. Since the mid-1990s, however, some empirically oriented psychologists have been influenced by a new approach called positive psychology. This relatively new field of psychology combines an emphasis on hope, optimism, and well-being with scientific research and assessment. Many of the questions examined by positive psychologists stem directly from humanistic theorists such as Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. Positive psychologists, such as Martin Seligman and Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, are critical of traditional psychology, which has resulted in a model of the human being as lacking the positive features that make life worth living. Hope, wisdom, creativity, future-mindedness, courage, spirituality, responsibility, and perseverance are ignored or explained as transformations of more authentic negative impulses. Some recent positivist psychology research, Hunter and Csikszentmihalyi, found that adolescents who take an active interest in life are psychologically healthier than adolescents who are bored and uninterested. Other research has shown that mental health variables such as optimism, intrinsic motivation, and self-efficacy are related to and predict academic achievement. In this section, we review in somewhat greater detail two studies on basic Maslowian principles, one concerned with personality development, growth, and goals, and a second dealing with the structure of mental health. Personality development, growth, and goals. Implicit in Maslow's concept of self-actualization is the assumption that people acquire greater levels of psychological health as they become older. Children and young adults struggling to acquire an education, a job, and a mate are not likely to have achieved the B values and the other criteria for reaching self-actualization. Does empirical research support this assumption? Jack Bauer and Dan McAdams assumed the existence of two kinds of approaches to growth and development: extrinsic and intrinsic. Extrinsic development is primarily cognitive and revolves around one's ability to think complexly about one's life goals, whereas intrinsic development is primarily emotional and revolves around one's ability to feel better about one's life. More specifically, extrinsic growth focuses on fame, money, physical appearance, status, and power. By contrast, intrinsic goals focus on satisfaction, happiness, personal growth, and healthy interpersonal relationships. Cognitive extrinsic growth and emotional intrinsic growth seem to be unrelated to one another, that is, one can be cognitively complex about one's life and not be happy or satisfied. In their research on growth goals, Bauer and McAdams predicted a qualified positive relationship between age and personality development and psychological well-being, one that would be mediated by intrinsic growth goals. In other words, only people with intrinsic growth goals would see that getting older results in greater ego development and well-being. The corollary to this prediction is that for those with extrinsic growth goals, getting older would not lead to greater personality development and psychological health. Participants in Bauer and McAdams' study included both college students and volunteers from the community. The former had a mean age of about 20 years, whereas the latter had a mean age of about 52 years, and both groups were about 70% female. Life goals were coded from responses to a task that asked participants to write a paragraph each about their two most important life goals. The goals themselves were not coded but rather the reasons for the goals. Specifically, goals were coded on whether they were intrinsic, extrinsic, or exploratory. Intrinsic goals were those that included making a contribution to society, enhancing interpersonal relationships, improving feelings of happiness, and fostering advancement toward personal growth. Extrinsic goals included wanting to gain money, status, approval, or some other non-intrinsic goals. Exploratory goals included those designed to understand and to seek conceptual challenges. In addition, the researchers administered an assessment of ego development and a measure of psychological well-being. As predicted, intrinsic and exploratory goals were positively correlated with maturity and personality development. People who are driven by happiness and need for conceptual understanding tend to be higher in ego development and well-being. But there were also more specific associations. People high in exploratory growth goals were especially high in ego development, and those high in intrinsic growth goals were especially high in well-being. With regard to age and personality growth, results generally showed that older people were indeed higher in ego development and well-being than younger people, and that this relationship was strongest for those with intrinsic growth goals. In other words, older adults had higher life satisfaction than younger adults. This was in part explained by older adults being more likely to have intrinsic goals and concerns. Bauer and McAdams concluded that growth goals, particularly when studied in narrative form, open a window for researchers and therapists to understand whether people's intentions are likely to lead in personally desirable directions, namely toward a more complex understanding of their lives and toward a heightened sense of well-being. This conclusion is consistent with Maslow's argument that people generally take either a safety or a growth orientation in their everyday lives, and that a growth orientation more readily facilitates psychological health and well-being. Components of psychological health. As we saw earlier, Maslow suggested that self-actualization people can be characterized by 15 different dimensions. From the 1950s through the 1990s, a number of researchers attempted to determine the structure of mental health and well-being. For instance, in the 1950s, Marie Jahoda was asked by the Joint Commission on Mental Illness and Health to review and summarize the literature on mental health. She concluded that 6 dimensions most consistently appeared: self-acceptance, personal growth, autonomy, environmental mastery, personality integration, and an accurate perception of reality. Many of these were in fact the same or very similar to Maslow's more exhaustive list. In the 1970s, Richard Cohen combined theory and empirical research and argued for 5 distinct dimensions of mental health: efficiency, relatedness, inner harmony, creativity, and self-transcendence. Later, Carolyn Ryff combined Jahoda's theoretical review with research on development and argued for 6 dimensions: self-acceptance, personal growth, autonomy, environmental mastery, positive personal relationships, and a sense of meaning and purpose in life. William Compton more recently contended that these approaches pre-existed the current modern era of research and theory on mental health and well-being, most clearly exemplified by the positive psychology movement discussed above. Compton argued that the investigations into the structure of mental health and well-being need to be updated. Moreover, the older, more classic approaches were subjective conceptual groupings rather than quantitative and objective groupings based in factor analysis. Compton set out to rectify these 2 shortcomings in the mental health and well-being literature. More specifically, he argued that current research on psychological well-being most consistently shows 2 core components: subjective well-being, happiness and life satisfaction, and personal growth, self-actualization, personality development, purpose in life. In addition, he believed that having an other-directed, compassionate, sense of religiosity would form a 3rd fundamental dimension of mental health. Compton tested these hypotheses by administering 10 different measures of psychological well-being to a group of graduate and undergraduate students. A total of 21 distinct scales or subscales were factor analyzed to quantitatively extract dimensions of well-being. We discuss factor analysis in Chapter 14. Results from his factor analysis revealed 4 relatively strong factors: 1. Subjective well-being or happiness; 2. Other-centered religiosity and a lack of social interest, Adler's concept of Gemeinschaftsgefühl; 3. Personal growth autonomy; and 4. Personal growth mature relationships. If one considers the 3rd and 4th factors to be variations on one factor, then one can conclude there is support for Compton's 3-factor model of mental health.